he would come up with something as what's the word I want? As I don't know. Liber 418 is something that you can use as a touchstone for all kinds of stuff, and he makes it very clear as to exactly how this happens and how this works. It doesn't come up much really anywhere else. And Crowley was very, for someone, and this is why part of the reason that I emphasize so much Crowley's own his credentials, basically, because at the beginning of the Book of Thoth, he makes it very clear: this is my case for the idea that the tarot is an ancient system, that it corresponds to all these ideas, that it actually belongs in place of this. Because, if you look at the historical record, and the tarot is where we aim on finishing this conversation, essentially, and we'll come back to True and Faithful and talk about it more and so on and so forth, but the Book of Thoth is kind of the place where Crowley's trying to basically say, here's my whole life and my whole system, and I'm going to try to make it all work using the tarot as a system of images. And when Crowley makes his case for the initiated interpretation, understanding that the historical record doesn't really go back past, I think, the 1750s. That's around the time the oldest tarot deck is the 1750s. Not totally sure, but roughly that. He makes his case based on other factors and correspondences to spiritual systems, which he goes out of his way to try to make clear in that book. And I think that's very significant that he would start off with that, because Crowley's not someone who's really invested on having like a creepy, witchy background for a bunch of stuff. If something's a recent invention, he's willing to admit that it's a recent invention most of the time, and he's not really invested in trying to convince people, okay, well, this is the ancient blah, blah, blah from whatever. And in fact, he mocks that idea a couple times in Magic Without Tears and in his own work, where he's talking about people who running around England thinking that we all have to be reincarnations of ancient Egyptians and this is our whole thing and like whatever. He openly mocks that kind of crap. Yet, he goes out of his way to defend the idea that the tarot is kind of a key to all this. And I think that's significant. And I don't think that it's an accident that he's doing this. There's certainly no evidence of a tarot going back as far as True and Faithful Relation, but the system that Dee and Kelly wind up getting with the 4 horsemen, the 6 seniors, the 4 kings, so on and so forth, this very easily corresponds to elemental, zodiacal, planetary attributions of ceremonial magic, which have become the de facto norm for ceremonial magic essentially since Dee and Kelly. And there are certain periods of the diaries that the angels say things which directly correspond to stuff from Agrippa, and he's kind of the person who, before that, made those categories distinct. There's actually one point where Kelly gets really pissed off because the angels are talking about, well, there's this portion of the earth that belongs to this, and this portion of the earth belongs to this, blah, blah, blah. Kelly winds up going to the library and reading some old Agrippa and finding that those distinctions are made in Agrippa, and so then he gets really angry and then he wants to take off, which, again, looking at this whole situation, it's significant to realize Kelly's the guy who's actually talking to them. Dee's not talking to them. There's no way Dee could have made up this story or took it out of a book and told Kelly. Kelly's the one who is so pissed off that he wants to run off based on the fact that he sees something, that he sees that what he heard is just coming out of a book. So, a book that was already in their library that he just hadn't read yet. So, that is in itself significant. But I mean, it's very clear that they're trying to build on what Agrippa started, and explicitly on what Agrippa started. This is what I tell people when they're trying to verify stuff from spirits. It's like, you don't necessarily need a weird correspondence from 777. If you're talking to a spiritual entity that exists outside of time and has knowledge of what is available to you, and they realize you have a paperback copy of 777, they're probably going to say something you can look up there because they're trying to talk to you. This makes sense with Dee and Kelly too. If they know that Dee and Kelly have studied Agrippa and they have Agrippa on hand, then it's an easy reference point. It's easier than trying to tell them something that they don't know how to communicate with, or something like that. But for Kelly, this was a huge issue. But I mean, if you look at this thing, Kelly blows up constantly. You have a period where he's like gets in a fight with one of the, I forget what the guy's position was exactly. Albert Lasky's butler, I think it was. They essentially got drunk together, and Kelly started saying that he could, have him executed if he wanted to, and started like hitting him in the neck with a broomstick, saying he was going to chop his head off and shit like that. And then they got into a fist fight, and Dee had to make a big deal out of it the next day and apologize to the guy and try to drag the guy back. And Kelly had to go and apologize, and Dee's making notes on this and just trying to like make sense of Kelly like going off essentially. And Kelly goes off a few times, but then again, this is completely logical. If Kelly's the guy who has to deal with these spirits constantly, and he doesn't trust them, and he doesn't like them, and he doesn't want to be there, you look at him just blow up and blow up and blow up. And you gotta wonder, like, what was this guy's life actually like? Like, how fucking miserable was he? He certainly didn't want to have a wife. I mean, this is the interesting thing, when you look at the idea that I was mentioning before, that there's a homosexual component to this, it's also important to remember Kelly didn't want to get married before the wife swap. The angels actually told Kelly, you have to get married. You get married to this chick. So they gave him the wife before they suggested the wife swap. This is significant because the possibility that maybe they recommended homosexual intercourse previous to this, and this was their solution. This was their way out. It's like, okay, well, in the church, under God, you are now one flesh with this person, so if you have sex with the other person's wife, it's like you had sex with them, essentially. And that wouldn't have even been possible with Kelly's initial sort of lifestyle or idea, because Kelly was not a hot prospect, really, before that. The only thing that's really known, it's not even really known whether his name was Edward Kelly. All we know is that he had a bad reputation for gambling and drinking, and he had his earlobes cut off for forgery, because that was a sign during the times. If someone has no earlobes, it means that they were forging documents of some kind. It was, before PIN numbers and social insurance. You could tell, don't take checks from that guy, essentially. Yes. And how this essentially evolves, the idea that the current of magic is something that has a flavor that changes over periods of time, and that goes in a direction that changes over periods of time, is fundamental to Thelema and is also unique to Thelema. It's only prefigured in Dee and Kelly. You will not see anyone else. I talked about this. There are groups that came after Aleister Crowley that kind of jumped on that idea, and they used psychological models to try to explain, okay, Isis, Osiris, Horus. Instead of that, they talk about the age of matriarchy, then patriarchy, then whatever they decide to call the last thing. They'll use whatever words they decided to make up. And really what they're doing is echoing Crowley without referencing Crowley. People love to do that. And you see these ideas crop up and crop up and crop up, but they never really make it explicit this is where they come from. And really it all comes back to true and faithful relation, because if we look at the ideas that the angels are trying to pass off to Dee and Kelly, and the period of time where it's really reinforced Christian ideas, and then the time that they're talking about a really revolutionary morality, that forces us to ask questions. And if we take these books seriously, it really forces us to say, okay, if we're taking seriously that they're speaking the truth sometimes and they're completely full of shit at other times, we need to use our own judgment and decide, what do we take seriously, how seriously do we take it, and why do we pick and choose the pieces that we're picking and choosing, because we have to pick and choose. There's no way to accept it all comprehensively simply because there's so much inherently contradictory material.
What would be their motivation for lying?